Hello, my name's Brad. I'm here representing a lot of the progressive students here at UMich. And I just have to, I wanted to know your stance on trans people as a whole, and then I'd like to maybe have a conversation, a short one about
Sure.
what you believe.
Well, first of all, thanks for coming in and asking a question, Isa. That's great. I mean, sometimes we don't get that. I mean, my stance on trans people is I'd like to characterize this differently. I think that there's a few different categories here, and everybody's lumping everybody together in one category. There are people who have long-standing gender dysphoria, right, or gender identity disorder, right? That's a real active disorder that does exist. Okay, that does not mean that these people are members of the opposite sex. Okay, this is where I reject the argument that if you have gender dysphoria, you have an actual mental disorder under the DSM-5. This means that if you're a man who believes you're a woman, this makes you a woman. You're not a woman, you're a man who believes you're a woman. I have tremendous sympathy for that difficult body dysmorphic condition. That does not make you a member of the opposite sex, because only objective biological reality can make you a member of one sex or another sex. Then there are people who claim to be members of sexes that don't exist, who claim pronouns that don't exist, who claim that they are gender fluid, which is not really a thing or has never really been characterized. There are folks who claim that without any evidence whatsoever that they have gender identity disorder, and that suddenly they discover at the age of 15 that they're gender questioning, but there's not really a persistent level of belief that has lasted for a persistent series of time, and people are being given testosterone or being given surgeries on the basis of this. And then there are people who are intersex, which again is another category. And I think what happens in these conversations, people tend to conflate all these categories. So what they'll do is they'll say, well, trans people exist. And I'll say, okay, so what do you mean by that? And they'll say, well, there are certain people who have Klinefelter syndrome. Okay, those are not trans people. Those are intersex people. That's a completely different category. Those are people who have an actual biological condition. They still happen to be a member of one sex, by the way. They're still sexed.
Yeah.
They just happen to have secondary sexual characteristics of the other sex. Okay, so that's my general perspective.
Yeah, I think for sake of brevity, I think we'd be able to have a conversation about gender. And I really fail to understand how you claim that there's a lot of genders that are made up, and this is. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? I think
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think that there's been a false distinction that's been made between sex and gender, and then gender has been read in as more important than sex. So basically, the idea of gender was a concept that was brought up by a college professor named John Money back in the 1960s, and the basic idea is that gender was a set of cultural characteristics that we impose on people of a particular sex. So it's not that women have babies, it's that women are gendered as though they have babies, and this is what makes a woman a woman. Okay, that's not correct. Women have babies. Or we'll say that gender is a series of characteristics that we put, it's a series of stereotypes essentially. But then you'll see the trans community argue that if a boy has stereotypical attributes of this gender, this makes them a member of the opposite sex, which doesn't make sense. You can have effeminate boys, you can have masculine girls. I mean, this has been a feature of life for all of human history. That doesn't make them a member of the opposite sex. So when people say gender, what I want them to do is define what they mean by gender. If they just mean a set of culturally attributable attributes, and they say that that's completely separate from sex, first of all, I reject that. I think there is a strong correlation between gendered behavior and sex.
Yeah, I mean, that's how we socialize children. I mean, I think it's a pretty, the connection's there, and I don't think it goes
It's not all
further.
socialization is the argument that I would make, and that's backed by the fact that in the primate kingdom, for example, there are heavily gendered areas of behavior. The notion that basically boys and girls when they're born are androgynous widgets, and then we make a boy by giving him a truck, and make a girl by giving her a doll, that's not true on any sociological level.
Again, I find it really... So we just clapped for Ben comparing primates to humans. I want to establish that. And then on top of that...
Well, I'm talking about the attribute of mammalian biology, so yes. In fact, I will argue, I'll compare human beings to literally any member of the mammalian species when we're talking about sexual dichotomy, which is the basis of all reproduction in mammalian species, yes.
Yeah, okay, but I do want to bring it back to the concept of socialization in children.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked a long time in public schools. I've noticed that students, this gender line that we're speaking of, the binary that you were referring to, I think many of us fall within those two lines, man and woman. I'm not saying it's you either have one piece of genitalia or the other. I'm saying like we have masculine and feminine traits throughout that we pick up from our family, the world around us.
Sure.
Yeah. So again, I'm feeling, if you agree with that,
That doesn't, but that's not what makes you a man or a woman.
The fact that we have to have these conversations repeatedly is mind-blowing to me.
Do you feel that a lot of your speech could incite the same kind of violence?
I mean, you heard my speech tonight. Do you feel that my speech could incite violence?
Well,
I mean that seriously. That's an honest question.
I know you're asking honestly. I feel that for me, as an individual, it isn't, but I could see how a lot of your points I really disagreed with. I literally have a list of
that's
questions
fine. I mean, that's the good
you.
part, right? Where we disagree and we can have a conversation.
I just was wondering in terms of, and what I mean by inciting violence is encouraging the same people who believe in like your transphobic beliefs, even that like homophobia is a sin based on your religious beliefs. Do you believe that because of what you say, you can encourage a lot of people to act on those beliefs?
So I have a very strong standard with regard to incitement, and I'm very consistent about this. If I'm not telling somebody to commit violence, I am not inciting them to violence. I've held the standard for Barack Obama when he was saying anti-police things, and then somebody went and shot up some police officers in Dallas. I said that's not Barack Obama's fault. When a Bernie Sanders supporter went and shot up a congressional baseball game, I said that's not Bernie Sanders' fault because Bernie Sanders wasn't calling for that. Political debate requires that you talk to people and people take your words as what they mean, not as an excuse to go and do violence. I've never called for violence, nor would I. As far as the idea that my words are some sort of attack, a violent attack, for example, on folks who are transgender, my view,
I'm not saying
I know, but
attack.
I'm responding to the people who are not you who might say that. Okay? So the idea that I am transphobic, for example, this is a bizarre kind of attack in the sense that I don't know that I've ever exhibited phobia of trans people. I'm not afraid of trans people.
Well, transphobia is more along the lines of prejudice against the trans.
So I actually think that your first characterization was right. I think that transphobia is really disagreement with the basic principle that the trans community is trying to purvey, which is that people's sex is malleable, that people can move from male to female, and that it is my job, objectively, to now call them the name they wish to be called, and to teach my children that men can be women and women can be men. I fundamentally disagree with that point. Now, with that said, is everybody in the United States entitled to the same rights? Of course, but your right does not extend to forcing me to call you what you want me to call you. That's not the way this works. That violates my freedom of speech. So, in interpersonal relationships, if I were out to dinner with a trans person, would I make a point of noting their proper biological sex? No, because that would be impolite. When I'm talking about the general principle of is a man...
A shout out to the young lady, though. She remained calm and respectful throughout. That's the way to debate.
You keep defining abortion as the murder of babies, which biological fact is you would say most abortions are done before they are actually babies. It's still just a fetus. So my question...
Do you know what the word fetus means?
It's just a cluster, a
That's
zygote
not what
developing
fetus
into
means.
a baby eventually.
The word fetus, it's a Latin word, and it just means offspring. That's all it means. It just means the next generation of a being. So, but that's what a baby is also. I mean, that's what you would call your adult child someday once he's grown, hopefully, if he hasn't been murdered.
Can I ask my question?
Well, I'm just like to clarify this point. You would call your adult child your offspring too, but all of these terms that you might use, fetus, embryo, the one they love is zygote, which sounds like a Pokemon, but they use all these different terms, but it's all referring to the same being, and you were that being once. You, the person who's standing here right now.
Do any of us have a memory of being that being?
No, I mean, I don't have a memory of last Thursday, frankly. It's been a very busy week, but the lack of a memory doesn't mean that it's all right to murder me.
Well, anyways, my question is, you stress murdering babies a lot, but when it comes to murdering babies, kids, and everything in everyday shootings that keep happening, you say nothing. So I ask, why is it okay to murder babies when it's regulating women but not regulating guns?
No, I say quite a lot about that, actually. I think the crime is a terrible problem, and I think it's just awful that liberals have funded and intentionally installed liberal DAs who won't prosecute violent criminals. This has led to an increase in violent crime, and it's awful. I totally oppose that. But it's not me and it's not my side that's funding that sort of thing. Now, you say, why wouldn't I want to regulate guns? Guns are very regulated in the United States as it is. And I've yet to hear one gun control proposal that would stop any of these shooting incidents that people talk about. People focus on the sensationalized ones from the news, a school shooting or a movie theater shooting. No proposed gun control legislation of the last 30 years would have stopped any of those. And the majority of the shootings are gang-related, and they're handgun shootings. And so I'm all for cracking down on those gangs and throwing them all in the can, but it's usually the liberals telling me that we have to abolish the police and go soft on crime, and they were just failed by society, and so we can't put them in prison, and we have to abolish the prisons too. That's not me. I'm all for it. You want to get me a bill, you want to elect me to office and get a bill in front of me that will crack down on gang crime and these gangsters using handguns to kill kids, let's do it. I'd sign that in 2 seconds. But it's not up to me, unfortunately. It's up to the side that I suspect you would consider yourself to be on.
No, it's up to a side that you're often a part of. And even if it's not you specifically, it's your friends and the people you support that just continue to... it's just, you aren't considering both sides and how, saying one thing can just contradict the other thing.
How do you think I've done that?
By saying you're murdering babies, blah, 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 just over and over again, but just not mentioning any of the babies being murdered every single day in shootings that haven't even made it to major news outlets because they're so common.
No, well, that wouldn't be a contradiction or a hypocrisy or anything. I'm focusing on one particular issue called abortion, but I actually mentioned in the speech tonight that specifically on the issue of black people being murdered, 10,000 black people are murdered every year with guns and knives and hammers and the like, but 242,000 black people at the very least are murdered through abortion. So that would seem to be a more pressing issue, but I brought it up. I'm all for trying to reduce the murder rate. Unfortunately, liberal DAs are not allowing us to do that. So you're more than welcome to convince your fellow liberals to stop funding these people and to start arresting criminals. But my side of the political aisle has been arguing to arrest and keep those criminals locked up for a very long time. And so there's very little we can do if the other side of the aisle won't work with us.
Nobody is smarter than a teenager repeating the things a teacher told them to say.
If we ignore truth in favor of woke lies, we damn to isolation everyone who mentions truth. Wokeness lies about the nature of truth itself. So, truth is really uncomfortable. Right? It's really ugly. It makes people feel bad. Now, I say facts don't care about your feelings, but feelings do care about the facts. And when you tell people that certain things are just reality, they get very angry at that reality. And so we create narrative instead of acknowledging facts. We start talking about my truth. Right? I have to express my truth. There's no such thing as your truth. There's just your opinion and the truth. That's it. Okay, but the idea of my truth has become very predominant when it comes to the woke, right? My lived experience is what matters, as opposed to, say, statistical data, or as opposed to the fact that there might be an alternative explanation for how you perceive things in the world. Okay, well, here are some facts. Right? These are all very uncomfortable, but these are facts. Income is not primarily a function of racial group in the United States. It is mainly a function of intelligence and hard work. This is why Nigerian Americans are the most educated group in America, and Asian Americans are the highest income group in America. For a white supremacist country, we are doing a terrible job at the white supremacy. Here are a few more facts. Races do not commit crimes at similar levels. In fact, races don't commit crimes at all. Individuals commit crimes. And those individuals can be classified theoretically by race, and those numbers might not be equivalent. People organized by race do not go to college at similar levels. They do not have children out of wedlock at similar levels. They do not study a similar number of hours. They do not have the same ages. They don't major in the same subjects. They do not get married at similar levels. None of this is racist. This is just fact. Culture and decision-making can close those gaps. We know this because these disparities have vacillated over time. Notice, by the way, I have not even named any of the races I'm talking about, right? Because those numbers can change. The fact is that in the white community, the single motherhood rate used to be about 5%. Today it's about 40% in the white community in the United States. Okay, that is a result of a culture that has been driven in the white community. Okay, those changes over time do not suggest changes in the genetic composition of white people. They suggest instead differences in behavior that are inculcated by culture. Here are some more uncomfortable facts. Men and women are different. I know this is a tough one. They are different in terms of how they are physically constructed. They respond differently to stimuli. They are biologically different. In fact, I hazard a guess to say that the propagation of the entire human species is a result of the difference between men and women. I know this is controversial stuff. But as it turns out, if men and women are not different biological categories, it makes it extraordinarily difficult for children to be produced. There is no such thing as a menstruating man. There is no such thing as a woman with prostate cancer. These things do not exist. Anybody who tells you differently is selling you something. But if we ignore truth in favor of woke lies, we damn to isolation everyone who mentions truth. We're not going to face up to any of our real problems or solve them, because problems demand solutions. Bitching about society doesn't demand a solution other than tearing down all the institutions, which of course isn't a solution, it's its own set of problems. So here's the bottom line. Americans hate this stuff, and they are done with it. Okay, what we just saw in Virginia is a result of this. What we just saw in New Jersey is a result of this. I think that what we've seen in Florida over the past several years is a result of this. Okay, last year was the year of wokeness, in which we learned that a lot of lies about America had to be taken as truth. We had corporations pushing the idea that the police are systemically racist. We had broad talk about defunding the police. We heard that the cure for America's racial division lies in more focus on race, rather than more focus on individuals without reference to race. We learned that all of our guiding principles had to be ditched in favor of equity. And you know what? Americans hate this crap. They hate it. The ironic part is that the only people in America who don't hate this crap are college-educated white liberals. Okay, minority Americans are not into this stuff. By polling data, more black Americans wanted more police in their communities, not fewer police in their communities. There's a reason the Hispanic vote is breaking away from Democrats right now. Democrats believed that they were going to be able to double and triple down on the Obama coalition of 2012. This coalition of supposedly dispossessed people, accompanied by some white liberals, and this would be the going, durable coalition for all time. And as it turns out, people don't like thinking of themselves primarily as members of a race. They like thinking of themselves as individuals. They like to be catered to as people who enjoy freedom. And guess what? Their priorities might mirror what they see in everyday life.
We'll say it's time we start uniting this great country instead of dividing it by race.
Play into this debate.
So I don't believe that consciousness is the sole criterion by which we judge the self-interest in human life. So we are unconscious a good deal of our lives, right? That does not, we will be conscious again, right? When you're unconscious, when you're asleep, for example, presumably your life is still worth living. If somebody came in and killed you, that'd be a serious moral quandary at the very least.
But the birth of consciousness, the lighting up of the flame, the initial lighting up of the flame, there does seem to be something special about that, and it's a mystery of when that happens.
Well, I mean, Peter Singer makes the case that basically self-consciousness doesn't exist until you're 2.5. Right? So he says that even infanticide should be okay. Right? He's the bioethicist over at Princeton. So you get into some real dicey territory once you get into consciousness. Also, the truth is that consciousness is more of a spectrum than it is a dividing line, meaning that there are people with various degrees of brain function. We don't actually know how conscious they are. And you can get into eugenic territory pretty quickly when we start dividing between lives that are worth living based on levels of consciousness and lives that are not worth living based on levels of consciousness.
Do you find it, the aspect of women's freedom, do you feel the tension between that ability to choose the trajectory of your own life versus the rights of the unborn child?
In one situation, yes. In one situation, no. If you've had sex with a person voluntarily, and as a product of that, you are now pregnant, no. You've taken an action with a perfectly predictable result. Even if you took birth control, this is the way that human beings have procreated for literally all of human existence. And by the way, also how all mammals procreate. So the idea that this was an entirely unforeseen consequence of your activity, I find I have less sympathy for you in that particular situation, because you could have made decisions that would not lead you to this particular impasse. In fact, this used to be the basis of marriage, right? Was when we were a apparently more terrible society. We used to say that people should wait until they get married to have sex, a position that I still hold. And the reason for that was because then if you have sex and you produce a child, then the child will grow up in a two-parent family with stability. So, you know, not a ton of sympathy there. When it comes to rape and incest, obviously heavy sympathy. And so that's why I think you see, statistically speaking, a huge percentage of Americans, including many pro-life Americans, people who consider themselves pro-life, would consider exceptions for rape and incest. One of the sort of dishonest things that I think happens in abortion debates is arguing from the fringes. This tends to happen a lot, is pro-choice activists will argue from rape and incest to the other 99.8% of abortions. Or you'll see people on the pro-life side argue from partial birth abortion to all of abortion. You actually have to take on sort of the mainstream case and then decide whether or not that's acceptable or not.
But to you, the exception, just ethically, without generalizing it, that is a valid ethically exception.
I don't hold that there should be an exception for rape or incest because, again, I hold by the bright line rule that once a human life with potential exists, then it has its own interest in life that cannot be curbed by your self-interest. The only exception that I hold by is the same exception that literally all pro-lifers hold by, which is the life of the mother is put in danger.
Such a tough topic, because if you believe that that's the line, then we're committing mass murder.
Well, or at least mass killing. So I would say that murder typically requires a level of mens rea that may be absent in many cases of abortion. Right? Because the usual follow-on question is, well, if it's murder, why not prosecute the woman? And the answer is because the vast majority of people who are having abortions don't actually believe that they're killing a person. Right? They have a very different view of what is exactly happening. So, I would say that there are all sorts of interesting hypotheticals that come in to play when it comes to abortion, and you can play them any which way. But levels, let's put it this way, there are gradations of wrongs. I don't think that all abortions are equally blameworthy, even if I would ban virtually all of them. Right? I think that there are mitigating circumstances that make, while being wrong, some abortions less morally blameworthy than others. I think that there is I can admit a difference between killing a 2-week-old embryo in the womb and stabbing a 7-year-old in the face. Like I can recognize all that while still saying I think that it would be wrong to terminate a pregnancy.
Do you think the question of when life begins, which I think is a fascinating question, is a question of science or a question of religion?
I mean, when life begins is a question of science. When that life becomes valuable enough for people to want to protect it, is going to be a question that is beyond science. Science doesn't have moral judgments to make about the value of human life. This is one of the problems that Sam Harris and I have had this argument many times, and it's always kind of interesting, because Sam is of the opinion that you can get to ought from is, right? That science says is, therefore we can learn ought. So human flourishing is the goal of life. And I always say to him, I don't see where you get that from evolutionary biology. You can assume it, just say you're assuming it, but don't pretend that is a conclusion that you can draw straight from biological reality.
It is one of the better discussions on this difficult debate that I've ever heard.
Proponent of pro-life. Can we start by you trying to steelman the case for pro-choice, that abortion is not murder and a woman's right to choose is a fundamental human right, freedom?
So I think that the only way to steelman the pro-choice case is to, and be ideologically consistent, is to suggest that there is no interest in the life of the unborn that counterweighs at all freedom of choice. So what that means is we can take the full example or we can take sort of the partial example. So if we take the full example, what that would mean is that up until point of birth, which is sort of the Democratic Party platform position, that a woman's right to choose ought to extend for any reason whatsoever up to point of birth. The only way to argue that is that bodily autonomy is the only factor. There is no countervailing factor that would ever outweigh bodily autonomy. That would be the strongest version of the argument. Another version of that argument would be that the reason that bodily autonomy ought to weigh so heavily is because women can't be the equals of men if the vicissitudes of biology are allowed to decide their futures. Right? If pregnancy changes women in a way that it doesn't change men, it's a form of sex discrimination for women to ever have to go through with pregnancy, which is an argument that was made by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, kind of. Those are the arguments. The kind of softer version is the more, I would say, emotionally resonant version of the argument, which is that bodily autonomy ought to outweigh the interests of the fetus up till point X. And then people have different feelings about what point X looks like. Is it up to the point of viability? Is it up to the point of the heartbeat? Is it up to 12 weeks or 15 weeks? And that really is where the American public is, where the American public is, broadly speaking, not state by state, where there are various really, really varied opinions. But like broadly speaking, it seems like the American public by polling data wants somewhere between a 12 and 15 week abortion restriction. And they believe that up until 12 or 15 weeks, there's not enough there to not be specific, but to be kind of how people feel about it, to outweigh a woman's bodily autonomy. And then beyond that point, then there's enough of an interest in the life of the preborn child. It's developed enough that now we care about it enough that it outweighs a woman's bodily autonomy.
What's the strongest case for pro-life in your mind?
I mean, the strongest case for pro-life is that from conception, a human life has been created. It is a human life with potential. That human life with potential now has an independent interest in its own existence.
If I may just ask a quick question. So conception is when a sperm fertilizes an egg?
Yes.
Okay, just to clarify
Yes.
the biological beginning of what conception means.
I mean, because that is the beginning of human life. Now, there are other standards that people have drawn, right? Some people will say implantation in the uterus. Some people will suggest viability, some people brain development or heart development. But the clear dividing line between a human life exists and a human life does not exist is the biological creation of an independent human life with its own DNA strands and et cetera, which happens at conception. Once you acknowledge that there is that independent human life with potential, and I keep calling it that because people sometimes say potential human life. It's not a potential human life. It's a human life that is not developed yet to the full extent that it will develop. Once you say that, and once you say that it has its own interest, now the burden of proof is to explain why bodily autonomy ought to allow for the snuffing out of that human life if we believe that human life ought not to be killed for quote unquote no good reason. You have to come up with a good reason, right? The burden of proof is now shifted. Now, you will find people who will say, well, the good reason is that it's not sufficiently developed to outweigh the mental trauma or emotional trauma that a woman goes through if, for example, she was raped or the victim of incest. Okay, and that is a fairly emotionally resonant argument, but it's not necessarily dispositive. You can make the argument that just because something horrific and horrible happened to a woman does not rob the human life of its interest in life. One of the big problems in trying to draw any line for the self-interest of life in the human life is that it's very difficult to draw any other line that doesn't seem somewhat arbitrary. You say that independent heartbeat, people have pacemakers. If you say brain function, people have various levels of brain function as adults. If you say viability, babies are not viable after they are born. If I left a newborn baby on a table and did not take care of it, it would be dead in 2 days. So, once you start getting into sort of these lines, it starts to get very fuzzy very quickly. And so if you're looking for sort of a...
Wow. Two people are having a conversation on a divisive topic, and the goal doesn't seem to be convincing anyone of anything. The goal seems to be furthering our consideration of this topic. I could listen to these two for hours.
In all of the chaos regarding the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh, we should remember one simple fact. If Kavanaugh were pro-choice, he would have been confirmed with 100 votes. He's clearly not an advocate for abortion, but Democrats didn't have the votes to stop him. So instead, Democrats decided to slander him as a gang rapist. Remember, Democratic opposition to Kavanaugh started not with Christine Blasey Ford, but with women in Handmaid's Tale outfits occupying the Senate confirmation hearing room, and pro-abortion protesters being dragged out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's not a shock that Planned Parenthood, the organization responsible for hundreds of thousands of abortions per year, openly threatens senators in poetry. Quote, "Roses are red, violets are blue. Senators vote no on Kavanaugh, or else we're coming for you. Hashtag National Poetry Day, hashtag Stop Kavanaugh." Now that's romance. Abortion, to the vast majority of the political left, is a sacrament. It's not merely a political issue. It is a defining character issue. If you are pro-abortion, you're a good, generous, decent person who values women. If you are pro-life, you are an evil, repressive, nasty person who wants to control women's bodies. It's that view that leads to incidents like this one, in which a pro-life advocate was kicked in the face by a pro-abortion nutcase this week.
It's a baby. If someone was raped and she gave birth and she decided to kill her 3-year-old child.
I meant to get your phone!
The pro-abortion movement suggests that pro-lifers are extreme. In reality, the extreme position on abortion is held by the Democratic Party. Their platform calls for legal abortion all the way until point of birth. But pro-abortion extremists get away with their rhetoric because they use euphemistic language to describe what exactly abortion is. In fact, the word abortion is itself a euphemism. The procedure of abortion isn't an anodyne polyp removal. It involves doing terminal violence to an unborn child. Ignoring that fact allows abortion advocates to avoid looking reality directly in the face. So, for just a few moments, let's look reality in the face. This is a picture of a 19-week-old baby. This is a human child. This is not a ball of goo. This is not a cluster of cells. In January, 44 Democrats in the United States Senate voted not to protect the rights of babies older than this unborn child. Only 3 Democrats, Joe Manchin, Joe Donnelly, and Bob Casey, voted to protect children at 20 weeks. Only 2 Republicans voted against such protection, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. Take a good look at that baby. That is a human being with 0 rights, according to the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And human life doesn't begin at 20 weeks. This is a picture of a baby at 12 weeks, barely 3 months. You can see this baby with his hands near his chest. This is not a cluster of cells. This is not a ball of goo. His genitalia have already been formed. His liver and spleen produce red blood cells. This is an unborn human being. Not a single federally elected Democrat would vote for an abortion ban that would protect this baby's life. And life doesn't begin at 14 weeks. This is a picture of an unborn human being at 8 weeks. You can identify the head of this unborn human. You can see where the small buds are forming for arms and legs. But guess what? Life doesn't begin at 8 weeks either. It begins at fertilization, when a new human life is formed, a new human being with its own DNA. This human being is not its mother. It is not its father. It is not a polyp. If we found a human embryo on another planet, the headlines would rightly scream, "Human life found on Mars." Human life is a continuous process of growth from the moment of fertilization onward. Abortion is the killing of this human life. The later the abortion takes place, the more brutal the procedure. But no matter the brutality of the procedure, it is obvious that abortion is not some mere optional surgery to be performed for convenience. And it's even more obvious that those who want to protect the lives of the unborn aren't trying to control women's bodies. Those who cherish abortion are trying to control and dismember the bodies of the unborn. Think about that next time you see a radical feminist in a Handmaid's Tale outfit suggesting...
Ben is so great. He defends the most vulnerable humans, and he makes me so proud to be on his team.
Hi, thank you so much, Ben, for coming to Cornell. My question revolves around wealth redistribution. You often argue against wealth redistribution and higher taxes on the wealthy. However, in the past 50 years, the wealth gap between the working class and the upper class has been growing by almost 10%, with single women, Africans, and Latinos being lower on the economic ladder, oftentimes, which you have said, are the people playing the victimization card. With these inequalities continue to grow, how can you not argue for some sort of wealth redistribution or taxes on the wealthy?
Okay, so there's a few points you made here. One is that when you talk about the gap between the rich and the poor, these are not stable groups of people. Okay, people go from the bottom quintile to the top quintile and back down to the second quintile and back up and back down. Okay, I in my life have been in probably the second to bottom quintile when I was growing up, and now I'm in the top quintile. Right? That's fairly common. This happens actually over the course of life for many people who just age in the United States. As you get older, you start to build wealth. Hopefully you get a job, and then you grow out of that. And the reality is that if you want to escape permanent poverty in the United States, you really only need to do three things. As I've discussed before, this is not my research. This is research from writers for The Atlantic, the Thurnstroms back in the 1980s, but it's been very well verified. You don't want to be in permanent poverty in the United States. Finish high school, get a job, don't have babies until you're married. Those three things, you won't be in permanent poverty in the United States. There is income mobility in the United States. That's number one. So when we say gap between the rich and the poor, you have to understand these are not stable groups of people. People are moving up and down between various wealth brackets. Point number two, the only way to solve the disparity in wealth, which sometimes is historic, meaning like your grandma had a house and now she passed it on to you. I will point out here, the vast majority of people who are very wealthy in the United States are not wealthy because grandma had wealth. Right? Elon Musk actually, contrary to popular opinion, did not grow up wealthy. Right? I did not grow up wealthy. In fact, most of the people that I know who are very, very wealthy did not grow up wealthy. There's tremendous income mobility. The way that you solve for wealth gaps in the United States is with better income mobility, and that only comes with an opportunity economy that allows people to move forward based on their efforts, right? Based on innovation, based on keeping the wealth that they generate in and of themselves. If you take that away from them, then it removes the incentive, and it also perverts the incentive structure. So there's that as well. And then finally, the biggest question of all is everyone, who talks about wealth redistribution, they like to talk about the wealth gap. Hey, I don't care about the wealth gap. I honestly don't. All I care about is the people at the bottom and are they getting better. I don't care if the person at the top is earning 100 times more than the person at the bottom. I just care whether the person at the bottom has a better life than they did 20 years ago. And it is bewildering to me that people are so concerned about what the guy next door is doing. Right? That just seems to me Cain-enabled jealousy. I've never thought to myself, man, my life is way better than it was when I was a kid, which it is, economically speaking. But you know who's way richer than I am? Elon Musk. And that's not fair. Right? That's a silly way to think about life. The question is whether all ships are rising. And for all of the talk about the middle class having stagnated in the United States, that is manifestly untrue. It is simply not true. And you can look in your pocket right now and you know it's not true. Okay, the device that you have in your pocket is a magical device that no one on earth had 50 years ago. It did not exist. And then only the rich people had back in the 1980s when Gordon Gekko was carrying around a shoebox on his head in Wall Street. And now we all have in our pocket more computing power than all of NASA had when we sent a man to the moon, right? That is because everybody has gotten wealthier through innovation. They start off as a luxury item, and then they become a common everyday necessity, right? Who would have called a cell phone in 1981 a necessity? But today you'd call a cell phone a necessity. We would all call a cell phone a necessity, and everyone in the United States who is deemed poor basically has a cell phone. Okay, that is because everybody has gotten a lot better. Final point on this. When you look at the wealth redistribution in the United States, the truth is the United States has an extraordinary amount of wealth redistribution. Very often when people talk about the income gap or the wealth gap in the United States, they're ignoring the benefits that are actually paid out from the top quintile on down. If you look at net benefits in the United States, if you look at net taxes in the United States, net taxes in the United States are not paid partially by the top quintile. They're paid entirely by the top quintile. Everybody who's below the top quintile is receiving more back in taxpayer subsidies and taxpayer dollars than they are paying in. So the United States has one of the most progressive income tax systems on the planet. In fact, if you actually wanted to have a more socialistic style welfare system in the United States, what you'd have to do is tax people at the bottom. Right?
Thomas Sowell said it best. I have never understood why it is considered selfish to keep what you have earned, but not selfish to take from others that which you have not earned.
Do you come from Holocaust survivors, or are you a Jewish family that didn't?
So my great-great-grandparents arrived here. A lot of our extended family was killed in the Holocaust, but our immediate
your
family
great-great-grandparents, but not your grandparents.
Right.
Oh, do you have friends whose grandparents were Holocaust survivors or anything like that?
Of course, many of them. Yeah, I've helped write memoirs of Holocaust survivors.
Yeah. Their families are kind of messed up, right? Like, my family is very messed up.
I mean, if you go through a trauma like the Holocaust, I would imagine
they teach that trauma between generations. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, trauma very often in a lot of circumstances is passed down. I mean, I know some kids of Holocaust survivors who turned out fantastic and some who didn't. I mean, that's
yeah. Okay, so you are officially woke. That is what wokeness is about. It's like, people's grandparents or their great-grandparents were slaves.
Well, that's okay. I understand that American history is filled with racial evil.
Yeah. And that causes some intergenerational trauma, which affects people's ability to be,
so let me
effective, things like that.
Fine. So let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
So if the idea is that history has consequences, of course that's true. That's not wokeness.
Yeah.
That is not wokeness. What wokeness suggests is that fundamental institutions in American society
are so... No, it doesn't.
Yes, it 100% does.
I ran Elizabeth Warren's campaign. I helped organize her volunteers around here. I am a representative of wokeness.
Okay, well,
and that's just, this is all it is.
Well,
when I went to go get my first tattoo, the guy had lightning bolts and 88s tattooed on his neck. And as a Jewish person, that's really messed up. It's basically a threat.
There are racist people who exist. The argument that you're making, and I'm going to close with this because this is going in weird directions, and I don't really want to.
No, it's not
I
going in a
don't
weird
really
direction.
want to get. Just hold up a second. I let you get out your arguments, and now it's time for me to respond because I let you say the full argument.
I'll let you respond, but
no, not but. Now's my turn.
You are not characterizing what I'm saying accurately.
Now it's my turn. Your definition is inaccurate. The reason your definition is inaccurate is because any sentient human being would acknowledge that history has consequences.
Right.
But if the idea is, but that's not what wokeism is. Wokeism is a different thing. Wokeism suggests that all inequalities of today are attributable to not only historic injustices, but also continuing injustices in the now. And that all disparity is attributable to discrimination.
Like that, but a conservative.
Not just that.
A conservative is the only person. And I want to know why. Why is it that conservatives are the only people who define it like that? Why are conservatives the only people?
Okay, so we're gonna have to stop here because this is going nowhere. But
what's up?
I'm gonna have to stop with this with you because this is going nowhere. All I'm going to say is this. To sum up,
I just am trying to understand your perspective. Just one more second. On a
fundamental level, you're shifting definitions to avoid the consequences of your own argument. And if the idea is, and final point, if you are going to hold on, if you are also, just final point to sum up there. Final point to say.
I can follow that.
Yeah, I just want to make, honestly, I want to make one final point to sum up there. if the idea is that traumas of the past invariably bleed down into the present, that does not explain why certain groups that have been historically not only marginalized but slaughtered in mass genocide are some of the most successful groups in our society. So if the idea is... If the idea is that past trauma always equals current inequality, or that my actions in, say, robbing a convenience store are attributable to bad actions that happened in Alabama in 1930, the answer to that is no. Don't rob the convenience store. The only way they are going to be able to break the chain of history is to make good decisions.
You can tell he wasn't prepared for a proper response. He kept shifting his definitions of woke and made his definitions that didn't align with reality.
Happy Halloween, Ben.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I have an issue with your stance on abortion.
Okay.
Right. So you define life as starting at conception through biology, pretty much. But I think you take the stance that life is intrinsically valuable because it's life. And that's where I disagree. I think there's two things that make life valuable. I think consciousness, the ability to experience pain, senses, and stuff like that, and personal identity. In particular, psychological continuity identity. So the fact that we have memories, we have relationships, people have relationships to us. I think those are
Do you need both of those, or is it neither or? I just want to clarify your position.
Either or.
Okay, so if it's either or, then people with Alzheimer's have real continuity problems, you can't kill them.
No, because people still have relationships with them, though, right? So like just because you have
I mean, you have a relationship with them, but with people with advanced stage Alzheimer's, they really don't have a relationship.
Okay, but for the sake of example, like let's say someone dies, right? The family gets to decide what you do with the body. Because I know what you say. When you say, someone says, oh, it's just consciousness, and then they're brain dead, you say, well, can you stab them? No, you can't. Because that's the family's decision what to do with the body. It's the person's decision what they want to do.
So if the family decides to stab them, it's okay to stab the
when they're brain dead? Yeah, if they want to
No, not brain dead. Let's say that you're comatose for a specifically and predictably short period of time, say 9 months.
Say now, well, what is the person... yeah. No. So I would say on the legal grounds, it would depend what the person put in their will. If the person has made clear statements like, hey, don't pull the plug on 9 months, then don't do that. Because I think the first choice is...
Right, but let's say the person has not made such clear statements. Say the person can't make such clear statements.
So and he's just in a complete coma?
Let's say the person has not drawn up a living will or had conversations like this. They're in a car crash, they get in a coma, you know that in 9 months they're going to come out of the coma, and they're going to be fine. Are you allowed to stab? Can the family say, you know what, these 9 months, stab the dude?
Wait, so they're fine, so they're going to get their memories back?
Let's say they don't get their memories back.
Then I would say then that person is dead. And yeah, if the family wants to pull the plug, that's fine. I would have no problem with that, yeah. No, I would have no problem with that. Because that person is dead.
You're getting into some dicey territory, dude.
No, I think that person is dead. Right? And that's the best way to define life, is personal identity and consciousness. That's what makes life valuable.
Right, so I think that, again, if you were to say both, that's too much. And if you were even to say either, I don't think either one of those legs stands on its own. Okay, because what you really mean, this is the thing about having a baby. It's a process of development. Right? And this is the point that I'm making. There's a period in this human life when that child does not have, or fetus or embryo, whatever you want to call it, when this living thing does not have consciousness and does not have a sense of identity. But in 9 months, it will have consciousness.
Well,
and even then, by the way,
babies
don't have a sense of identity for at least a certain number of months after they're born. I mean,
the babies can recognize their parents' voices after they're born.
That's not a sense of identity. Rats can.
No. I'd say it is because it's a form of memory though, right? And that's what I was using.
So are you a Jainist? Because animals also have consciousness.
I would say that killing animals is wrong. You have no problem with that.
So just to get this straight. Killing Fluffy the hamster, deeply wrong. Killing a dude who's going to wake up from a coma in 9 months with memory problems, totally cool. Okay, I mean...
It's crazy how Ben can use someone else's argument against them. Impressive.
In response to an article you wrote about healthcare and armchairs.
Yes.
And my first
This one, the left hated this one. Oh, yeah.
I was not a fan either. But
good, I'm glad you came in.
Yeah, thank you. So I was wondering, you said that if you had to go find a cheap x-ray or a cheap armchair, you would go to find an armchair.
If your life depended on, you have to find a chair today and buy it now.
Yes.
Versus you have to find an X-ray and buy it now. You would buy the armchair, yes.
Yeah. So my question is, part of what allows you to find a cheap armchair is that there's such a difference in quality.
Yes.
You know, you can go and buy a chair that's $5, probably going to break soon.
Yep.
But so with healthcare,
which I said in the piece actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with healthcare, if it's something you don't really want to go like some guy who's offering a $5 X-ray and say, hey, you want an X-ray? You know,
why?
So, because if your life depended on it, I don't think that it would be a situation where you'd be willing to risk the.
So let me ask you this: why should an X-ray cost $200, $1,000 through an insurance company? It's literally a machine, and an X-ray technician takes a picture of it and then sends it to a radiologist who actually looks at it. Right, or a doctor looks at it.
So I don't know enough about the healthcare industry to answer that. But
The reason I'm saying this is because what I'm saying is that one of the reasons these things are so much more expensive and so much less competitive is because you do not actually have a free market in healthcare. You have a heavily regulated market in healthcare. If you want cheap X-rays, you have to have a competition in the X-ray business. There is no competition in the X-ray business. You can't go and look up a list of X-ray companies that are going to give you an X-ray today and then call them for the lowest price. In fact, if you go into the doctor right now and you say, I want you to take a look at this X-ray, how much will it cost me? The doctor will tell you, I can't give you that answer. Right? The doctor will tell you, I'm going to have to talk to your insurance company, or maybe I'm going to have to run it through my system, and then I'll get back to you. Is there any other product in America where if you went into a restaurant and you said, how much is that cup of coffee? They said, drink the cup of coffee, we'll tell you later. Right? It's not a free market. The point that I was making with the armchair comparison is not, of course, that armchairs are morally equivalent to healthcare. Obviously, people need healthcare more. Okay? Perhaps a better comparison would have been bread, right? Because people need bread. Okay? But the reason that bread is cheap is because there's a free market in bread, not because government is subsidizing bread. So the point that I was making is if you actually want to increase supply, the point I was making in that column, and overall about this, is that healthcare is not a right. Healthcare is a commodity. And the difference between those two views is that if you think healthcare is a right, now you're going to use the government to cram down on doctors that they must serve you at a particular price, or cram down on taxpayers that they have to pay for a certain level of your care, or cram down on insurance companies that they can't be insurance companies anymore. They have to be health coverage institutes, essentially, which is when they say you have to accept pre-existing conditions, it's not an insurance company anymore. If you had a fire insurance company and they said you have to accept pre-existing conditions, it would just be called the piggy bank. Right? You'd burn down your house and then go get fire insurance. So insurance companies don't work that way. So the point I was making is if you view it as a commodity, you're going to end up making it cheaper, more plentiful, more available, more competition. And the case in point of this is LASIK eye surgery, which is really unregulated. So LASIK eye surgery used to cost like $20,000 an eye. Now it costs $3,000, $4,000 an eye. The reason for that is because the insurance companies won't cover it and because there's a competitive market because it's really expensive, right? So lots of doctors now want to be optometrists or ophthalmologists and do this sort of work. This is why my wife's a doctor, so I'm very passionate about this particular topic. They call it the road, which is the successful doctors, radiologists, ophthalmologists, anesthesiologists, dermatologists. All those people basically charge cash and don't work through insurance companies. Right? The vast majority of them work in high-level private industry, and that's if you want to make a lot of money, that's what you do. And so what you're getting is in medical schools, if you're aiming for lots of money, you go into one of those four. You're not a primary care physician. You're one of those four. If you want more primary care physicians, what should you do? You should incentivize it. What Bernie Sanders and the rest of this crew want to do, they declare it a right, and then they take away the incentive. They declare it a right for you to have health care, and then they say to the doctor, you're going to work, and you're going to like it, and we're going to make you work. And this is why there's a black market in healthcare in Canada, there's a black market in Israel, there's a black market in the UK. It's why people come here from all of those places to get their surgeries. So here's the reality about socialized healthcare. Socialized healthcare is good for very, very basic things, right? It's like emergency care. The same way if you walk into an emergency room today and you need an X-ray, they'll give it to you regardless of whether you have insurance, which is true. This is why in California you have a major problem with illegal immigrants who don't actually have health care coverage walking in and to the ER and using it as their health care coverage. Basically, socialized medicine works the same way, except there is no upper echelon. They've made it equal at the expense of the upper echelon. Meaning that if you now want a surgery, you got to wait 6 months online for it because we didn't give any incentive for people to become surgeons. Right? There's no cost-benefit analysis.
It's amazing how individuals who have unlimited access to premium health care are very opinionated and in favor of the abhorrent prices and discrimination by these companies against people with low incomes and those who are chronically sick.
Doing grave damage to kids by arguing the opposite.
I think we should allow them the space to explore that. If they
by the way,
yeah.
I don't, first of all, I do think that it is very important to provide rules and rules for kids. I think the idea that kids are to be sort of left out there in the wild and then they do whatever they do, we don't treat them like that with nutrition, we don't treat them like that with education, we don't treat them like that with a lot of things. And the idea of teaching boys to actually embrace their boyhood, I think is quite a good thing. Now, there are exceptions to every rule, and there are kids who are, as I say, boys who will be more effeminate, and they shouldn't be bullied for that or mistreated for that.
Yeah,
but to suggest that this makes them trans or makes them a member of the opposite sex is the thing I'm really arguing against, because that ends in a lie that leads to suicidal ideation, it leads to tremendous confusion, it leads to tremendous psychic pain. You're telling a lie to a kid, and lying to kids is not something I'm very much in favor of.
Yeah, and I think, speaking on suicidal ideation, I think maybe denying the fact that, like, it's okay for, a young person to decide if they fall within a certain gender line. I fail to understand how that affects you personally and how that hurts the child.
Right. So anytime society sets a rule, it affects me personally. You're not asking me how a kid in Saskatchewan identifying affects me personally. You're asking me to go along with the lie that kid's personal subjective sense of identity shapes the definition of sex, and that I refuse to go along with. Because as you say, kids are in fact malleable. And the notion that we're supposed to teach all 5-year-old kids that you can be a member of the opposite sex is deeply disturbing, chaotic, and wrong.
Again, and that's not what I'm prescribing. I'd like to be clear that what I'm saying is they should be allowed to explore whatever portion of
if by allow it depends. If by allow you mean, do I think the kids should be like locked in the Matilda chokey for playing with a doll or something? Obviously not. That's child abuse.
Often, yeah, in very orthodox spaces.
Child abuse is illegal, and it should be illegal. Okay, but the notion that if my kid expresses gender confusion, that I'm not allowed to say to my kid, my son comes home and he says one day, you're a girl, and he says I'm a girl, and I say to him, you're not a girl. That's biologically untrue. You're a boy. When you're a kid, you're confused in your feelings. The idea that that's a form of child abuse is a lie. That is not a form of child abuse. That's actually how you parent.
Yeah, and again, I'm allowing you that space, but on the other hand, you're opposing the very opposite. You're saying that it's sick and twisted for parents to allow their kids to explore different parts of themselves.
It is sick and twisted to present kids with the notion that boys and girls are not separate in humanity, and that boys and girls are not two separate and dichotomous forms of the species Homo sapiens, and that the idea that there is no biological reality to that whatsoever, so that a boy can be a girl and a girl can be a boy, that is a form of child abuse. That is the same thing as me teaching my kid that my kid can be a horse. My kid cannot be a horse. That is not real. And if I were to teach my kid and take seriously the argument that my kid could be a horse, I'd be doing them tremendous psychic damage. I'm sorry, I feel like we're kind of running out of time here, but I really appreciate that.
Could I just get one more thing?
Sure, well, go for it.
Again, I'd like to, we're making comparisons to animals, and you're getting a chant for it. And again, it's not my favorite thing.
Yes, because...
But I appreciate your point in saying that, you would be willing to allow another family to let their child explore, certain genders.
Well, I wouldn't allow a child to explore the lie that they can be a member of the opposite sex.
Oh, there you go.
If they want, but if they become, I disagree with the basic idea of quote unquote genders entirely. If the idea, because if you're going to degrade everything down to the behavior of human beings, then we all have our own genders. Literally every single human, we could just have names. We can get rid of the idea of gender entirely, and I can just call you Bob, right? Like we can all have our own. That's the easiest way to do this. We treat each other as individuals with a bevy of different attributes, rather than saying my gender is pansexual, fluid, 45, XYZ, right?
That's so dishonest.
How is that dishonest?
You're making this straw man about pansexual gender.
No,
name a gender. It isn't, and you know it is.
So you do it. You name a gender that you think exists outside of male and female.
No, I agree that people can lie within the bounds.
Okay, well, again, I really appreciate the time of the back and forth. I think it is productive, and I appreciate you doing it.
Yeah, no, and again, I don't believe any of you have malice views. I think a lot of your views are founded in the reality of the world, but I hope that you at least would allow yourselves to come out to some of the more progressive groups and maybe have these conversations.
By the way, having conversations like this, I encourage everybody who's conservative to have these kind of conversations to go on the other side.
That was my intent in coming here. and seeing how hard you guys were on the protesters out there who were using their First Amendment right was really tough to watch, especially for Americans who claim that the First Amendment is something that you co-sign. I'm sorry, but I have to say it.
I've worked a long time in public schools, is one reason many parents have been homeschooling their kids for years.
You've built so much of your platform and the Daily Wire's platform on arguing that woke liberal agenda is threatening free speech, yet your own party's platform relies on white evangelical Christians who like to ban children's books such as Harry Potter. How do you reconcile censorship within your own party and your own claims that you support free speech so fully, or are you just arguing against ideas that you disagree with?
What you are referring to, typically speaking, is what we allow children to see. Free speech rules do not apply across the board with regard to children. Okay, there's no state in the union that, for example, bans you from buying a book from Amazon from Toni Morrison. It doesn't exist. What is actually happening is that when you have a school library, local people who go to the school and the school board set the standards as for what they wish to allow their children to see in the library. That seems perfectly appropriate to me. That is not a violation of free speech any more than it would be a violation of free speech to suggest that, for example, a sixth grade library not include Playboy or not include Larry Flint. Okay,
But what about Harry Potter?
What about Harry Potter? Meaning that if you want to
evangelicals ban Harry Potter.
If you want to send your kid to a school that allows Harry Potter in the library, by all means do so. My kid's school does include Harry Potter in the library. It's a free country. That is not the same thing as banning Harry Potter. Banning Harry Potter would be to say that you cannot, under penalty of law, you cannot disseminate Harry Potter in, say, the state of Alabama. And if you sell it in the state of Alabama, they will prosecute you and put you in jail. It is a dramatic misnomer to suggest that, and I like when people use Harry Potter as the example because honestly, like name the list of schools that are banning Harry Potter. I can name you a list of schools that is much, much longer that's banning, say, genderqueer for fourth graders, which seems totally appropriate to me. I think that risque sexual content that countenances a wide variety of sexual mores is not appropriate for fourth graders, and I don't see what's even remotely arguable about that. I would suggest that there's actually both a right and a duty for the state legislature to ban the dissemination of that material in schools completely, because it seems to me that that is totally appropriate for parents and community members to discuss with their kids, not for taxpayer-sponsored apparatchiks of the NEA to leverage their morality on kids. And if the state agrees with me, they should vote that way. And that is not a violation of free speech. We set standards every single day as to what kids should and should not learn in schools. For example, I would imagine that you, for example, would not be a fan if a state decided that you had to, for example, teach creationism in the classroom. You would not be a fan of that. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so you don't want that. Isn't that censorship of creationism? The answer is it's not censorship of creationism. School boards get to make these decisions because you always have a scarcity of time and a scarcity of material you can teach kids.
But creationism...
That moment she realizes, yeah, I've lost this one, and starts moving away from the mic while Ben keeps talking is classic.
I think that teaching kids, as we are now being told, teaching kids that they must use preferred pronouns, or that men can become women can become men, sex doesn't exist, as a recent op-ed in the New York Times said, that's asinine, anti-scientific, and counterproductive.
So my main disagreement with you is on the subject of transgenderism.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've seen in the past is that you said one of your principal objections to the transgender movement is that you think accepting them into society won't necessarily help solve their problems. Is that like a fair characterization of what you say?
No, I mean, I think that I don't think it's fair in the sense that I think everybody should be treated with a certain level of dignity. But what I have said is that I don't think that the high transgender suicide rate is attributable to societal intolerance.
Okay, so I sort of disagree with, or I don't think the empirical evidence necessarily says that. I've seen studies from UCLA that have drawn different conclusions, but I realize if we disagree on the empirical evidence, not much can be resolved here tonight. So assuming that it would help to accept them more into society, would you change your position on transgenderism?
So the position on transgenderism I want to clarify so that I can tell you what I would change and what I wouldn't change. So what I would not change is the idea that you cannot force people to call you what you want to be called. That is anathema to a free society. I will also not change the idea that we should not indoctrinate children in blatant biological falsehoods like there's no such thing as male and female. I think it's very important that kids know there is such a thing as male and female, and that these are real categories, and that a man cannot become a woman and a woman cannot become a man. I think that confusing children about this stuff carries its own inherent dangers. Kids are easily confused and easily screwed up. So I think that would not change. I've also said in conversations with people like Blair White, who's a transgender woman, meaning a man who believes he's a woman, I've said to Blair, like, if we were at a restaurant or something and we were out to dinner together, I wouldn't go out of my way to call Blair White a he. I mean, presumably we'd be speaking in second person with one another. But at the same time, like, for the same reason that, you know, there are people in my life who do lots of things that I disagree with, and I don't feel it necessary to launch a conflict on the basis of that every time we meet. But that's a different thing than what the transgender rights movement is saying. What they are saying is that society should cram down on people perceptions about biology that are false, that we should treat it as bigotry if you use the actual biological pronouns for people. This is a form of bigotry and hate, which is nonsense. It's just something you don't like. There are lots of things I don't like. It doesn't mean it's a form of bigotry and hate. And that's where I stand on this. So again, I think that we should try to treat people with as much civility as possible. And in my position as a public figure, you know, I am very often speaking on the general kind of issue. I'm not speaking on one-to-one, you know, out to lunch or something. That's a little bit of a different thing. You know, when my child is 4.5 years old, right? She comes to me and she will say, Dad, I drew a picture. Do you think that it's good? And the answer is yes. I mean, I love my daughter. Sure, the picture is great. Now, is that, if I'm an art critic, is that going to change my definition of good or art? No. I mean, if I were the art critic at the New York Times and I were reviewing my daughter's picture, I'd say this is garbage. It's not good at all, right? I mean, but my public position is that I am the art critic at the New York Times discussing issues of public importance and public policy. I don't think that it is the responsibility of other people to protect your fragile mindset. With that said, if people wish to do so out of a certain level of sympathy, I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, if you want to, in interpersonal connections, do that. But I think that teaching kids, as we are now being told, teaching kids that they must use preferred pronouns, or that men can become women can become men, sex doesn't exist, as a recent op-ed in the New York Times said.
When disrespecting, pronouns are considered worse than threatening actual violence, you know it's about time to get the hell out of there.
They have to make this case that all inequality throughout society is evidence of inequity. To reach this stunningly idiotic conclusion, they employ the following argument. Wokeness makes a very strong claim with regard to inequality. Wokeness claims that all inequality in life is evidence of inequity. Now, this is a semantic trick, right? You understand that they're taking the word equality, and then they're taking the word equity, and they are hoping that you noticed that a syllable just went missing there. And that when they say inequality and inequity, what you really think is, okay, well, equity is a good thing, and so if something is unequal, that means it's not equity. Okay, these words have completely different meanings. Okay, if something is unequal, this does not imply that something unfair happened. If you worked hard for your pay today and somebody else did not work hard for their pay today, you received unequal wages. This does not mean that some deep, abiding unfairness has taken place. But nonetheless, they have to make this case, that all inequality throughout society is evidence of inequity. To reach this stunningly idiotic conclusion, they employ the following argument. They begin with, all people are created equal. Not in their rights. All people are created equal. You are equal to the person sitting next to you in every conceivable way. Thus, if you are equal to the people sitting next to you in every conceivable way, any groups are equal in any conceivable way. Because again, if you are all exactly the same, doesn't matter how I divvy up the room, any group is going to be the same as any other group. Thus, all disparate results between groups can only be due to either natural differences or discrimination. But it can't be natural differences because you're exactly the same as the person sitting next to you. So it must be discrimination. Right? So that's the sort of idiotic syllogistic logic that's being used here. Now, the problem is that pretty much every single one of these premises is false. Now, unless you think that I'm exaggerating the case, that I'm just making up what the wokes say about this, they say it right out. It's not like they're hiding the ball here. Ibram X. Kendi, who for some odd reason has been hailed as some sort of intellectual giant, when the man has intellectual wattage that, if translated to electric capacity, might be able to toast a piece of bread lightly. Ibram X. Kendi argues, quote, as an anti-racist, when I see racial disparities, I see racism. Any racial disparities, this means racism. This also means, as the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of African American History and Culture proposes, that inequality exists, and thus, all racial groups struggle under white supremacy. Now, again, every single one of the premises that we just discussed is false. All people are not created equal in every single way. We are created equal in the sight of God. That means that we have individual rights before God. That does not mean that you are equal to the person sitting next to you in any sort of capacity. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. But I would guess that in most capacities of life, you are very different than the person who is sitting next to you. You have different skill sets, you have different innate qualities, you've grown up differently, you make different choices. Secondly, if all of us are different, this means that not all groups are going to be equal. Any two groups, anywhere, are going to have different characteristics. If I took a line and I split this room, this half and this half, there would be different average characteristics in this half of the room versus that half of the room. That is just a statistical reality. On average, groups are different. Finally, differences between groups could be due to natural differences, i.e., if you take a group and they are very old, they're going to have natural differences with a group that's very young. So for example, if you look at income statistics, very often you'll see certain groups compared to other groups in terms of income. Well, what if the average age of one group is very different than the average age of another group? That happens to be the case in the United States, by the way, between black and white. The average age of white Americans is closer to 60. The average age of black Americans is closer to 25. And what does that mean? It means that on a wealth level, you would expect older people to have more wealth. They've had a lifetime of accruing wealth. So you have to adjust for age.
The only way we could achieve perfect equality is if literally every single person was a perfect clone of each other. And if one of them broke their legs, then we would have to break everyone else's legs to make them all equal again. Thanks for watching our video on how Ben Shapiro brutally crushed woke culture. His sharp arguments and bold statements have sparked a lot of discussion. If you found this breakdown interesting, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more insightful content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you next time.